Okay. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this sixth meeting of our Muslim World Network seminar series. For those who, and as you can see, we are now recording the event because this will be available on our YouTube channel. So you can also see people who you know who might not attend the meeting that they can see and watch this seminar there. Sorry. And okay, today we have the pleasure of having with us Seema Golestaneh, who will present a case study from her book. The book is titled, the first book is titled Unknowing and Everyday, which traces the social and material life of mystical epistemologies in Iran. Seema Golestaneh is Associate Professor in Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University, and her research, situated at the nexus of anthropology and religious studies, is focused on contemporary Islamic thought in personate communities. She currently is also working on a new project, which is an intellectual history of Islamic leftist thought in the 1980s, 1990s in Afghanistan. The title of her seminar today is Unknowing of Body, Aesthetics, Politics, and the Dissolution of the Self in Sufi Iran. Seema, the floor is yours. You can take as much time as you want. Generally, we go for 30, 45 minutes, up to 45 minutes, and then we leave room for questions. But even if you take a little bit longer, it's not a problem. Please.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Lily, for all your help and organizing. Thank you, everyone, for coming too. I know it's a busy time of year, so I very much appreciate it. And, you know, this is also the beauty of Zoom, where I'm really grateful to be able to work with colleagues and meet people from, you know, across the deep blue sea. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And as Fabio mentioned, I'm going to speak today about a sort of a case study on my book. Actually, is it possible to, is that super, share the screen or?
Yeah, please try. It should be allowed.
Okay. Let me try. Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, it's telling me I have to quit and come back. Okay, let me try that. Okay, so apologies. Okay, I think this should work now.
Yes.
Can you see
yes.
everything the slide? Okay, wonderful.
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Let me just, I'm so sorry, correct this.
No problem at all.
So yes, as Fabio mentioned, this talk is entitled Aesthetics, Knowledge, and the Dissolution of the Self in Sufi Iran. Before I get to the case study, I'd like to discuss a little bit sort of my research as a whole. So a little bit of background. I worked with a number of disparate Sufi orders, you know, collectives located in different cities in Iran. I mostly worked in Isfahan, Kerman, Tehran, and to a much lesser extent in Shiraz as well. So all my interlocutors were Persian-speaking, you know, were Persian-speaking ethnic Persians who were Shia identified, who all claim some sort of lineage with Shah Nimatullahi Vali, a 14th century sheikh who ultimately settled in Kerman. So some of these collectives are part of larger orders with an established history. You know, some have been disrupted over the centuries, but quite a long silsile. They have branches throughout Iran, and other groups are much smaller, more kind of localized congregation styles, collectives. All my interlocutors also lived lives that were quite indistinguishable from non-Sufi Iranians, meaning they went to work, they went to school, they didn't have any sort of, you know, notable dress, although there was a trend of some men with the very distinctive long beards. But mostly they came from, again, indistinguishable, and they came from a wide array of different class backgrounds and education backgrounds. I'm happy to speak more about the demographics later on, but I just want to sort of set the stage for that. Despite these differences, one sort of identifying feature of the group was their particular interpretive stance towards matter fact, or unknowing, as I'm calling it. I have to say too, sort of a caveat that matter of fact, of course, is a hugely diverse term. There's a lot of different definitions of what matter of fact means, but when I'm using it here, I'm just referring to what I think are my own interlocutors' interpretations of the term. And so what I found in my research was that for my interlocutors, Sufism was not an escapist or transcendent phenomenon, but something that held real application or amal for their everyday lives. And in order to understand this, I found I had to take mystical ideas very seriously. To think about, for example, what does it mean when Sufis talk about fana, the dissolution of the self, the ego, not as a metaphor, but as an actuality. So, what is unknowing? It's a concept that's first and foremost based on the affirmation of the unknowability of God, that it's ultimately impossible for humans to fully understand the divine. And yet, what is fascinating is that rather than consider this understanding an obstacle to thinking or contemplation, these Sufis see this as an opportunity for a new type of knowledge, a new type of thinking. In other words, they firmly position themselves at this juncture, at this juncture of the limit of human thought. And so, in developing their epistemologies, they're operating from a position of accepting and, if anything, emphasizing that there will be always that which we do not know. So, we might posit unknowing not as a form of anti knowledge or even meta knowledge, but rather as an awareness of that which we do not know, an engaged awareness that we know nothing. I'll keep going a little further. And while I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of Muslims would agree that God is unknowable, it's beyond human thought, these Sufis again take it as a sort of conceit of their broader knowledge. For one example, we can see here a quote by a recent quote of the Nahboodi order, Haj Noeli Tabande. He describes matter of fact as knowing, yet knowing has different stages. Gnosis, that's their translation actually, is not an absolute matter. It is something that, as the philosophers say, is graduated, tashkiki, such as light and faith, which have degrees. More than anything else, this process continues endlessly. Here then we see one of the first aspects of unknowing, that it's a process that contests the finality of thought, suggesting an intimation of knowing as a process without endpoint, and that there will always be that which we do not know. But again, it's far from removing, the idea of knowledge as a whole. It's really pushing knowledge, as I say, to its limit. Rather, it moves thinking into something more generative rather than an automatic, systematic means to an end. It's a constantly searching, ceaselessly critical, investigative device. And knowing, ultimately, I think it's exactly that. It causes one to unknow something. To know something is to feel more comfortable with it, like, okay, I'm aware of that, I know that. To unknow something is really to question it. It takes a seemingly concrete and finite idea and unravels it. It sort of blurs its beginnings and endings. It remembers, for the anthropologists, for all of us here, it leaves the familiar unfamiliar, and in some cases can put existence into question. As the 11th century writer Ahmad Ghazali has explained in his famous treatise, Savaneh, this station of tabaqat, this station of matter fact, is beyond the limit of knowledge, aql. An elusive expression of knowledge cannot reach it any more than its outward expression, ibarat. However, the illusion of mystical epistemologies will indicate it, for unlike knowledge, the boundaries of which are well constructed, the boundaries of mystical epistemology leads to ruin. Here is the dashing of waves of the ocean of love, breaking on themselves and returning to themselves. So this ruination of boundaries, that which cannot be contained, this is something I saw throughout several of my case studies. Which brings me to my next point, is how we have this sort of understanding of unknowing now, or at least this interpretation. And what I found really remarkable was that this was, again, not just an abstract concept, but that it was applied to people's everyday lives, the socio-material realm, or to use more Sufi terminology, the profane realm. And so time and again, I saw my interlocutors tell me how they appreciated about Sufism with its application, its amal. And so at the heart of the project are 4 ethnographic case studies. In each instance, I trace the affective and sensory dimensions of Marifat as it influences the mystic's understanding of text and authority, the self, memory, and place. I speak with 2 sheikhs who believe in the endlessness of meanings found in works of poetry, the ultimate unknowability of the text, and how that leads them to confirm the limits of their own authority as interpreters and subsequently as spiritual leaders. I also work with listening practices within the musical zikr ritual, and how that can reconfigure a configuration of the self as an unbound entity. And I'll talk more about that today. And hopefully if we have time, I can talk about this idea of the loss of self, how it relates to, Iranian thinkers like Ali Shariati and Jalal al-Ahmad, who in the pre-colonials or the pre-revolutionary, era, we're talking about a return to self. And I'm happy to talk about these other sort of case studies as well. But ultimately, what I found I was doing and it took a long time to come to this conclusion, was that I thought I was looking at ultimately an ethnography of an idea. And how, I could say the ethnography of the interpretation of an idea, but that's even more unwieldy than ethnography of an idea. But today I know I'll be talking about mostly the unknowing of self as it relates to both the body and the sort of the socio-material realm more broadly. And before moving to the case today, we'll give a bit of a disclaimer that, when I talk about Sufism in the book, the relationship or the positionality of Sufism within Iran is quite complicated. What gets called Sufi, what gets called Irfan, which is often tied to more of a literary tradition, and what gets called the tasawwuf, which is mysticism, kind of more broadly, has a really complicated history. And even the politics of Sufi orders has changed drastically, not only even in the 20th century, but going way back to, the early modern period, if not more than that too. So I'm happy to talk about this, but I just want to note that I don't want to sort of posit Sufism as the heterodox form of Islam versus like the orthodox, the theological, cross-pollination between Sufism and Shiism, here 12er Shiism, especially within Iran, is quite complicated. So I'm happy to talk about that more if folks are interested. Okay. But with that, I'd like to move to my case study, and I'll start with an excerpt from some field notes. Upon arrival, it is already very crowded. We locate spots on the floor, silently and gingerly stepping around the men and women already seated. Those who come after us hover around the doorway, spilling out into the next room. No matter, they'll still be able to hear things from there. Entering the room, one first notices that the walls are as crowded as the floor. From the carpet to the ceiling, the sides of the room are a veritable display case of instruments. Long-necked sitars and slim nays, round and delicate daf drums, and even a sturdily mounted, heavy-looking santur. From calligraphic works large and small, relaying surahs from the Quran or ghazals from the medieval Persian canon, their thick black ink appearing even more emphatic against deep gold inlays. The 2 largest words are invocation, Ya Hazrat Maulana, Ya Hazrat Ali, and there are more strings of prayer beads pinned at various intervals, 2 old cloaks, a bit like the clergy wear now, chains, and dasbi, the objects used for self-flagellation. There are also photographs, candid snapshots, and formal portraits of several Iranian Sufi qutbs and sheikhs of various orders, both those within Iran and those who live abroad, accompanied by a good number of photographs and sketches of the ustad, or the master who works in this space. He himself sits at the front of the room, on the floor like everyone else, slowly leafing through a large volume of poetry, his gaze cast downward. Several other enormous tomes are placed around him. The rest of the room sits quietly. Not long after, the Ustad clears his throat and begins. He starts with Maulana Rumi, reading through the lines and in the same breath offering his interpretation. He speaks slowly and deliberately, taking pains to provide emphasis where he deems necessary, holding his gaze out to the listeners. Did they understand his point? He discusses literary allusions and contesting views, metaphors and rhythms, asks questions to no one in particular, and sometimes offers answers. He moves through the tomes, reading the words aloud, then speaking their meanings, his cadence going up and down like the swirling calligraphy on the page. And the people listen, mainly intently, it would seem. Men and women, the youngest seems to be a boy about 15, the oldest a wiry octogenarian with a thick white beard, sit with serious countenances, some with gazes downward, others with gazes upward. A few look at the Ustad with a strangely impassive, almost knowing glance. Some are already crying. This goes on until slowly the Ustad concludes his reading and brings out his kamanche, resting it upon his lap. He starts to play an improvised sort of melody. A frame drum, a daft player, joins him, softly, playing from the back of the room. The phrases are mournful and contemplative, the punctuations of the daft drum acting more as emphasis, a friend verbally agreeing with you, rather than a rhythmic pace setter. The sing-song phrases continue, until suddenly you realize the melody has become more focused, more assertive, no longer sliding back into silence or starting over again. The phrases are always improvised but always driving forward. The dav too is going faster and faster. The steady pace continues until one begins to realize the sounds of a kamanche are increasing in volume, increasing in tempo, when suddenly you realize they have reached a rollicking pace, the emphasis coming on the beginning of each measure, forming a sort of repetitive and hypnotic phrasing. Long morphal notes emerge sporadically, their duration all the more pointed, as they are swept away by the quick ones that succeed them. It continues in this way until all becomes about that one note, the ones that follow simply trailing in its wake, allowing you to prepare yourself before the onslaught returns. And suddenly the kamanche has fallen away. The Ustad joins the daft player until there are only these two frame drum players. They go quickly and quickly, faster and faster the notes comes, forming a staccato beat. The player moving their whole bodies now, shoulders rising. All is rhythm now, impact and speed. The old man with the wiry beard rocks his head forward and back, raising his hands from above his knees as if in danger of losing his balance. Several women bury their heads in their hands, their sobbing filling the space. Other heads turn away slowly, sideways, tilted one way to the others. Others move up and forward, back and down, or side to side, their bondings demanding recognition with movements as affirmation. The rhythms continue. We are lost somehow, pulses quickened, and for no other reason than the sound emitted by the players before us. Our circulatory systems responding to the pulses of the drums, disoriented in the wake of an external rhythm. Who? Breathe deeply in the wake of fast pulsations, I have been told, so you may keep your calm. Louder and louder until an abrupt and dramatic stop. The room returns the silence of the drums as bodies relax and soften, and people sit wordlessly for a minute longer. Slowly, we begin to disperse. I catch the eye of my friend Nusha, a student in her mid-20s, across the room, and she smiles widely as we meet, the lines of people slowly swarming into a mass around the door. So how was it? I ask. Did you go into a state? Rafti hall? I find myself asking the question somewhat shyly, I think, because having spoken to Nusha before, I know she chooses her words very carefully and does not like to think of herself as one of those, in her words, crazy Sufis, something that going to a state of hall might suggest. This time, however, it seemed she had no such reservations. No, it was really great. I was in another world. توی عالم دیگه بودم. During fana, I have enough energy for the whole week now. And my field notes. A moment in the real to fuel a week in the unreal. This musical poetic gathering described here is called the zikr ritual. Zikr means remembrance or recognition, arising out of the triliteral root to remember. Through music and listening, poetry and contemplation, the zikr offers an opportunity for the individual to remember God so fully and completely, the self is totally subsumed in the divine. This active extinguishing of the self is called fana, as Nusha describes experiencing above. With Islamic mysticism, the self is typically understood to be a burden, an obstacle, something that impedes one's ability to achieve union with God, understood as tawheed. Just to give a few examples, and it's the literature, the medieval literature, the early modern literature is full of how the self is an obstacle. I have these two quotes here by Junaid, who wrote maybe one of the earliest and full treatises on fana. I summoned the self to the Lord, it did not answer, and I abandoned it and went to the presence alone. O Lord, how long will there be a me and a you between me and you? Take out the me, so my me will be in you, so I will be nothing. So, I can speak more about this, but this is just to give the general sense, and the Sufis won't have some general sense of ideas. Some have more training than others, but it's something most will be familiar with. And all the people I spoke with were understood this too. So moving it back to sort of contemporary Iran, how is this idea of fana, this very seemingly abstract idea, the dissolution of the self, the extinguishing of the self, all these different translations happen. How is this understood in Iran today? So what I found was kind of different understandings of zikr and fana. They kind of fall into two categories. The first group understands fana as a break of sort of from the real world, although that's the unreal, the socio-material world. This is a loss of a much more sort of socialized self, interpreting the loss of self as the weight of what we called identity politics to the self and society. The second group articulates this loss of self in much more sort of classical theological terms, where they talk about the lowering of the quiet self, the nafs amara, and the turn to things like non-existence, nahboodi. And if we have time, I'll have a little bit, which I'm not sure, I'll talk about the relationship between fana, listening, and the body as a means to this sort of alternative knowledge as well. And how especially the body might be an alternative bodily knowledge, and the sensorial listening might form an alternative to the sort of Foucauldian body too. This way we might consider zikr as an aesthetic phenomenon as well, where listening acts as a merge to sort of critical engagement for the destabilization of subjectivity. And again, in either ways, we see an advocacy for this unraveling of subjectivity in favor of these more opaque and existential kind of registers. To unknow the self is to allow for the formulation of a radical subjectivity, non-subjectivity, which is necessary to become closer to divine. Again, and what I find here is that this goal of union with God, which here they're often called tawheed, cannot be achieved through purely rational thought, or even if that's involved in the process, or the liberal autonomous self alone. There needs to be some sort of transfiguration to get closer, if not fully achieve this kind of union with the divine. Okay. And I'm happy to talk more about this actual group. In the book I call them the Noor Street Collective. It's probably the more informally kind of organized group out of all the chapters I worked with. But they still had, and they were quite open. So you had people, as I mentioned, with different levels of training, and I'm happy to talk about more how they identify and move forward. But first, I want to discuss, the group I mentioned first. You discussed the extinguishing of the self in terms of what would be called the loss of sociopolitical identity and or material conditions. And so for this group, the lessening of the self meant that they were freed from the concerns like things like unemployment, financial problems, family issues. They're enfeebled from the difficulties of life, essentially. And so what I found, this group is kind of less interested in the refutation of the self as a whole and more interested in a distancing or liberation, perhaps you can say, from a certain type of self. This articulation of fana seems to me decidedly distinct from the forms of unknowing of the self discussed in the more classical literatures or by some of my other interlocutors. And I'll give just an example about how some of these folks understood fana. So the first quotes I have are from, again, these are from some younger women who had been involved with this collective. And I asked them, basically what they saw as the objective of the ritual. And they answered by saying, one, this woman, Sarah, right, the goal is to, quote, become close with God. I feel so close with God during the zikr. Her friend Sitara added, I became very aware of God. This is what the zikr should do during, make you remember what is important. And then Sarah elaborates. She says, during the zikr, I feel a sense of calm, aramish. Oops, sorry. So she says this is her experience of fana, the loss of self. I don't have to worry about things that are bothering me or occupying my thoughts, like getting a job. It's tough for everyone, but I think especially tough for women. There are so many more qualified women than men. I feel like sometimes they'll hire men over women because they think, oh, she will go and get pregnant or he needs to support a family. Anyway, this has been on my mind a lot as I'm looking for a job. And then during the zikr and for some time after, I don't have any of these worries. I have none of these worries. Maybe that is off topic. She sort of laughed as she says this. I don't know. Anyway, I don't have these problems women have to deal with during the zikr. End quote. So we see here the trials and tribulations of the quotidian realm. Here the gendered nature of job searches fall away during the zikr ritual. Her experiences are so tied to this dilemma in her life that her entire discussion of the zikr focused around this pressing issue. She didn't talk about the music or the poetry or the content, but basically the injustices she felt that she was encountering as a woman. I also think it's interesting how she mentioned that was sort of off topic, and it reflects a bit of self-awareness that perhaps this is what she's expounding on is not typical of a discussion surrounding zikr, but not enough to backtrack on her statements. And then, I continued and asked her friend. She says, quote, I agree. When you are with God, there are none of these types of concerns. You cannot have any of these concerns, meaning like looking for jobs, things like that, because you are with God. What type of concerns? I asked. The things that preoccupy us in this day and age, money, how we appear to others, traffic. Given the often heavy traffic in Iran, this is not a weird thing to say. And she said, and ultimately I found for sitar and these, fana presents an opportunity for the self to be wrested away from the heaviness of the ordinary. And while the idea that the extinguished self is one disengaged from the unreal is highly prevalent within mystical thought, it's Sarah and sitar's particular attention to the unreal that is noteworthy. For them, fana indicates, first and foremost, a destabilization of the social self. And I received numerous iterations about this, that to remember God is an affirmation of what is significant in life, not to be concerned with insignificant things, which were, again, similar, making money, getting exam scores, things like that. Jealousy, you should all kind of avoid this, of course. Just one sort of more example of folks within this category. I spoke to a woman named Minu, and she was also a zikr attendee in her late 20s. And she described fana as a momentary relief from worrying about a possible military strike against Iran. This is obviously before the recent war. And she says, quote, when you go into fana, you leave this world, this country with all its problems. I don't have fears of someone attacking the country, end quote. In this remarkable statement, Minu explains how she experiences zikr as a form of escape, leaving a world where she and her loved ones have a target on their back, a target that is perpetually going in and out of focus depending on the whims, moods, and election cycles of politicians a world away. Zikr and the extinguished self are here a negation of the unreal. Again, the social world were characterized as a realm full of precariousness. Indeed, Minu's description of the social world as less a prison of the self, as explicated by the classical literatures, but a place or a plane full of vulnerability and powerlessness that exists as a result of geopolitical tensions. In other words, it's not a distancing or separation from the beloved, i.e., God, that causes anguish or even weak human traits such as envy or ego. It's the current sociopolitical situation that is identified as the primary source of pain. And so she continues too, and she says, fana is a type of freedom, azadi. And I ask, what type of freedom? She says, a gentleness in my body. When you're lost in God, there is no stress. So again, it's something that's free from worry, free from fear. So this is sort of a rough overview of this section and this kind of really intriguing shift of contemporary interpretations of fana. And I do think, and I can speak more about this, I think some element of this has to do with this group being very open. There's not a huge amount of formal training you have to do or study you have to do to come in. It's anyone who wants to. But again, the idea of the self as being this sort of convalescence of a series of essentialized categories determined by larger power structures is a very different move from, the classical kind of literatures. What is noteworthy, however, is that this form of discourse has entered interpretations of mystical experiences. The removal of these human elements have been transformed into a removal from the discourses of power. Okay, so that's the one group. From here, I'll move on to the sort of second group, as I'm calling it. I know this is like very sociological, where I'm like group one, group two, but it sometimes helps just to organize thoughts in that way. So this group, their sort of version of events, if you will, is quite different. For these folks who are invested in fana as a type of rupture, escape, it was not about the sociopolitical realm. It was about the transformation of the self through modes of things like non-existence, nahboodi. And so they would explain their experiences of fana through the poetical, theological language found in most of the literature. And so explorations of fana and zikr do not utilize the language of social identities, but instead revolve around what may be called more abstract registers. And so we can think about that and also hopefully quickly get into how fana fits into broader notions of subjecthood. So here we have the section I'm calling fana as experiences, as appearance of the divine / real. Abdullah Khan was one of the oldest individuals who attended this Noor Street collective. He had the facial hair of Sufis of a bygone era with a very full beard and mustache, curled mustache, now gone white with age. He'd grown up in a nearby village and had little formal education, but as a young man had briefly studied at the foot of a Sufi master. One day, the pier he visited saw Imam Ali on his night flights, and after that, he said his sheikh could make the blind see. And Abdullah Khan was so moved by this man that he wished to devote his life to Sufism originally, which at that point meant a little bit more engagement, sometimes even living in the Khanagah full time, the meeting place. But ultimately, he was dissuaded by his father, saying that you should enter into a more sort of normal life. And so I asked Abdullah Khan about what he talks about the remembrance of God, zikr Khuda. And then Abdullah Khan gave me a skeptical look. I said, well, what do you want to know? The remembrance of God is the remembrance of God. Well, I started, he responded, see, you can't think about it too much. You have to feel it, hiss, to really understand zikr. If you must think, you must think with your heart. The answer is already there in your heart. If you can access it. You said your field is anthropology, no? And in Persian, the term is insan shenasi, which is like understood as knowing of humans, roughly. And he continued, but the thing is, you could never know humans, right? Only God knows. And of course, we don't know what God knows either. This is what we must remember too when we remember God. We are lost in Him, and remember that which is in your heart. You must remember with every single cell of your body, not only during the zikr ceremony, but when you do your prayers, when you go by bread, always. End quote. Here, zikr is understood as an occurrence that could and should happen at the most quotidian moments. It's not a phenomenon that is relegated to the time and place of the ceremony at all. Such thinking is in line with many injunctions in Islamic, not just Sufi, thought that the remembrance of God must be a constant activity in one's life. Still, there's a contrast here with the language of rupture that my other interlocutors were talking about. Abdullah Khan also related a story about how he would sometimes hold silent zikr by himself. It's the one person kind of zikr. When the children were young, many years ago, he said, we would sleep on the roof in the summer before we had this air conditioning. Sometimes that was when I would have wonderful zikr under the stars. I would be in another world. It would become another world. End quote. And I love this phrasing he has here of to be in another world versus it becomes another world. This distinction is subtle but also very powerful. Abdullah Khan spoke the statements with barely a pause between them, self-correcting almost immediately. The former assertion indicates an ontological relocation of the individual, the latter, a broader ontological shift, one of entire plane of existence. His words evoke the power of the transformative effect of meditation, a practice of mystics from time immemorial. And fana for him, I'll give a little more quote. The last one from his fellow, I promise. And he said, quote, fana is non-existence. It is the creation of nothing, so that you might be filled with something. That something is baqa. Do you know baqa? I did, but asked him to explain it so I could understand his interpretation. Baqa is the other half of fana. You enter into baqa. You are no longer yourself. You don't exist. I said, what happens to you then? Do you feel anything? Do you think anything? What happens? He replied, I don't exist. Sometimes I feel intoxicated, masked. I am in the tavern of ruin. It's the typical metaphor. His conviction was palpable, infectious even. If I wish to understand contemporary Iran vis-a-vis my conversation with Abdullah Khan, I have to say it would be interesting because I would say hard-pressed to learn anything in a way. And yet, perhaps this is exactly the point. Unlike the experience of fana for Sitare and Sara and Minu, the socio-material world is irrelevant for Abdullah Khan when he's in state. He speaks instead of non-existence, the tavern of ruin. Ultimately, his views on fana reflect not only a different interpretation of the annihilation of the self, but a different understanding of the structuring of the world. I sometimes still wonder if unknowing of self equals unknowing of world, but that's another issue. For him, the socio-material world is in fact something that can fade into the background during fana, rather than give shape to its whole existence. I also spoke to a younger fellow who kind of had a similar understanding of fana as well. And for him, he writes quickly about fana as a transformation of the self as well. He describes it as, quote, the self as a prison of the soul, but he's a little bit more melancholy than Abdullah Khan. And he says, if marifat is the contestation of thought, or, if I'm saying marifat is the contestation of thought, then unknowing of self for these two fellows, and I can speak more about it, is a move away from, again, these bounded selves. Ultimately, again, for time, I'm going to go sort of run through the second example, but I'm happy to speak more about it. For them, I think what I want to emphasize is that the veiled world is not escaped, but dissolves into another world entirely. The first group is an affirmation of the socio-material world, even as they overturn it. For the second group is a much more profound rendering of it, in some ways leaving it irrelevant. And so, I think we're almost out of time then for my talk. I have some other things I'd happy to talk about more about the unknowing of body and also how we might understand this idea of a loss of self as it relates to earlier pre-revolutionary ideas of a return to self. So I'm happy to speak about that more, but I also don't want to go on for too long if it's okay.
It's up to you, Seema. If you want, you still have 10 minutes. I mean, up to 10 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. There's 10 minutes left.
I mean, if you want, yeah, no worries.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. My apologies then. I'm sorry about that. My time is off today. Um, and so I will give a little bit of sense of moving to the idea of the body then. I'd like to explain that because we did that long opening with the listening part. And again, so really sort of tantamount. So we have these two groups, and I think, one is rendering the social kind of irrelevant. The other is affirming it, even if they're moving away from it. But I also want to touch about the sort of the importance of music and bodily knowledge in these forms as well. So in the last part, I like this part. This is Abdullah Khan, I'm sorry. This is the sort of the unknowing of body that comes in this part here. So in this section, I'd like to think about what it means to understand the zikr as a corporeal experience and how mystical epistemologies might influence these aesthetic encounters. In a very basic way, what is the role of music in the transformation of the self? Why is sound necessary to dislodge subjectivity? And what specific qualities does the auditory possess to carry out such a lofty task? In other words, how is the destabilization of subjectivity achieved vis-a-vis sound, the defining characteristic of the zikr ceremony, and how is movement involved? I go back from the earlier quote by Abdullah Khan, who said, "You must listen with every single cell within your body. You must remember God with every single cell within your body." He was a really passionate fellow in general, but when we discussed about this, the discussion of the body seemed particularly urgent as he insisted on this type of listening. He said, "You must look inside your heart. The heart knows, not the mind. God is in the heart and body." Badan. I said, the body as well. The heart as the abode of the divine is a very common sort of, I don't say trope, it's a common refrain or idea. But the role of the body was much more contested. He said, yes, of course, quote, "the heart is in the body, so the weight of the heart is through the body. You see there are layers. First the mind, concentration, tamarkoz and things like that. Then the body, breathing, nafas keshidan, and listening, sama. And then moving. Then the heart. Each one is a layer until you're living in the world that is beyond ours. So it's layers upon layers. In Abdullah Khan's statement, there's a clear hierarchy of faculties: mind, body, heart. So in other words, it's the rational, the mind, the sensorial, epistemological, the body, and then the heart, which I tend to think of it as a sort of cultivated, instinctual kind of form of knowing. So it's not even the sensorial, but something else. And so there's a lot to be said about this progression, especially when Al-Ghazali has a very famous sort of long essay on listening to music. He also talks about the ethics of it, but it also is this like sort of hierarchy of transformation. And this is something that a contemporary Sufi writer, Sayyid Osmayesh, has also worked on answering, and he's looked at some of the writings on his basically aesthetic theories. And through his writings, I wonder if we might understand the role of the material body within zikr as a space of metaphysical mimesis. To explain, Osmayesh is invested in something he calls inner music, musik-i batini. So he writes, quote, "The Sufi seekers are intensely interested in the inner music in their body, the inner vibration coming from the source of their hearts. They try to listen to their heart, try to hear their heartbeat. This heartbeat reminds them of something of their origin." So if we think about this, it seems to me the purpose then of the instrumental music is not to act as a spiritual guide in and of itself, but as a means to return or reveal, to say, sort of the inner percussions of the body. He says also, quote, "Every rhythm, every melody is like a bridge to the heartbeat. When you play a certain rhythm for 2 minutes, your mental and spiritual state changes." As such, it's for this reason that the zikr mainly utilizes the percussive music of the daf, the drum, as its sole instrumentation. The staccato beat of the drum mimics the percussion of the heartbeat. And it's to the batteries of this later sound that people dictate their movements. On the path of irfan, we work on this transformation by certain music, certain rhythms, and inner music. End quote. Therefore, listening to this type of music is able to make one conscious of these otherwise unconscious bodily rhythms, therein offering what we might see here as a strange form of automimesis. In other words, through contact with a foreign substance, hear this music, the rhythm of the body's movements mimic the rhythm of one's own heartbeat. It's an externalization of what was there all along. And it should be noted that this revelation through mimicry is, of course, certainly not a stable phenomenon or one that comes easily, as the participants need to reenact these motions again and again, incessantly repeating the bodily gestures as this newfound awareness continually slips back into unawareness the moment it comes into fruition. It's caught in this very dynamic kind of exchange. So when we're thinking about, folks who are, and again, it's this goal of this dissolution of the self is also, it's important to say, it's never fully achieved only by the saints, but you get closer, you're sort of in and out, you get closer. And so, and this is where in the zikr ritual, you're supposed to remember each moment, each movement is ideally is a form of that moment of recognition. You forget and then you remember. And so when you think about this, there's a type of knowledge associated with it that's just characterized as much by consciousness, unconsciousness, this heartbeat that we're aware of only when there's something external. It's a phenomenon brought into fruition by this sort of unhinged experience of the body. Here's an understanding, and this I think is when we see sort of a metaphysics of the body for heightened corporeality, offering an instance of what anthropologist Michael Taussig calls, quote, the bodily unconscious, where, quote, the self becomes a part of that which is seen, not a sovereign transcendent, and thought is more like poetry, end quote. Offering an instant of corporeal poetics, here is understood the unknowing of body, a realm outside the confines of pure reason. Quote. I'll close out with this. The rhythm united the heartbeat of two or more people to become one rhythm with hearts of thousands. We are invited to reason, but at a certain point, thinking stops. End quote. In other words, the listener is mimicking not the music itself, but that which is heard through the body. And so this listening subject begins to disappear into the listening act. And then the Foucauldian sort of social body of the everyday may be transformed, if only fleetingly, into this auditory body. Ultimately, as some of my Sufis told me, the goal is to need no music at all, but to develop such sensitivity to one's listening ability that even listening to silence becomes revelatory. And it's interesting too, last quote I'll give by Osmayesh says, if we put it differently, we can say that Sufism is based on silence and listening to the inner music. The goal of the seeker is to become one, to unite with this inner music. In silence, then, we are able to see the more idealized form of the body, wherein one is freed from the need for sensorial experience as impetus to experiential knowledge. And it operates between what we call sort of instinct, as Nahboodi Talbande says, during your journey into the darkness, you are being guided by your heartbeat, your sixth sense, between the provinces of knowing and forgetting, between the material and the metaphysical, the body and the soul. The event of the instantiation of fana culminates as a new existential composition for the participant, interfacing silence and sound, ecstasy and exhaustion. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you to you, Seema. I'm trying to find the reaction button where I cannot find it anyway. Okay. I do what they all do.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you again, Seema. I really think there are a lot of different points you discussed that relates a lot with some key core interests of our network. So now I'd like to open the floor for questions. We have more than half an hour, I think. Yes, around more than that. So please, the floor is open for questions. Don't be shy, of course.
If possible, can I ask a question about terminology?
Of course.
Yeah, so from what Alexander Knish wrote, that there is a sama and zikr, and there is a difference between them, but you are using zikr because of the local tradition, or so what is the reason behind that? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. I'm using, yes, zikr was what my interlocutors used for talking about both the ceremony, but also remembrance of God. Sama absolutely is. I speak about it elsewhere as they approach it more as a form of listening practice, which is a means to transformation. But zikr, yeah, they really emphasize about the question of remembrance through the ritual, the listening practices. But sama they use as tied to listening in particular. And zikr is both remembrance, but they'll use it as a shorthand, not just for the ceremony, but also for just like remembrance of God here and there, or it can be silent readings and things. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, when you ask questions, if you can introduce yourself just briefly, would be nice.
I can also ask
Yeah.
a question, perhaps. So I really enjoyed your talk, Seema, and many things resonated with my research, and I think with
Yeah.
research of many of the members of our network. And so I was really intrigued by these two groups. I found it fascinating how you try to capture this relationship to the social material world. And so I was still trying to think what it would mean. I mean, how can we understand, approach these two groups? And so I was, in a way, is it that, because you started your talk saying that you think fana is not really an escape. So quite often when we think of mysticism in a conventional sense, we really think of the escape into the transcendence. And so living in a way also maybe connected with religion, understood as a private practice, and that is different from the public space and profane world. But it seems that the second group is not so concerned about these boundaries, apparently. So it's maybe not that they really. So has it to do with the fact that some of them may be closer to Baka? And is Baka then really being in in the social material world, if you like, but in a different way that makes it not so important to think of this sort of. So I'm still trying to think
Oh, for sure,
with you,
yeah.
and I think this difference is really intriguing. So I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And yeah, sometimes now, even still after doing that, I was like, was there other ways to organize them as well this way? So that's definitely something there. It started off just, I was wondering, because, fana was a big part of conversations and things, but it's such a gnarly, kind of convoluted, again, abstract concept. So I was wondering, I started just asking people, what did it mean to them? And this was sort of the two kind of responses I ended up beginning with some things in the middle. But then you have the first group who, it's very much an escape from the everyday and the quotidian. And that language is very unusual if you look at like any literature kind of on classical literature, or even like 20th century, 21st century writings by Sufis. You will see it in some more self-help books in Iran that are more kind of like mystically oriented. So it's not entirely out of the blue, but that's all part of like a late, more recent phenomenon. And so I do think with the second group, yeah, I think what I found, I think one kind of like the point I wanted to make is, so this group who, when they talked about fana, they are not talking about the world. They don't talk about family. They don't talk about traffic. They don't talk about any of these. Um, but they were committed to understanding it through this, more classical language. And so for me, I was thinking like, well, this is somehow I guess my argument there is still that it's still, what does this mean, this position that people believe in this and has a possibility for like essentially the irrelevance of the material world, at least in these moments. So if they're thinking, what happens during the zikr ritual? Where are you? What are you thinking about? So they're able to envision a world where the social world is not even on their train of thought. So I mean, like, I think what I'm trying to get at is, within Iran, what does it mean that such a possibility exists? And not just because it's religion and everything, in Iran, it's in the public sphere and the state, etc. But the idea that they're able to envision a place, or whether it's sort of a mindset, and I think in some cases it could be baqa, which is like the substance. Other cases it's getting closer to divinity. I think the fact that for me, it's a powerful move because it can render sort of the social world irrelevant rather than just like an overturning of it in that way. And so, it's like the opposite of hate, of love is not necessarily hate, but again, irrelevance, or like not caring. And so in that way, I think there's something sort of powerful about it as an alternative. The other is sort of like revolutionary in the classical, like Enlightenment kind of way, is being overturned. The other is like on another kind of plane, if that makes sense. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, so in the meantime, Leila had to leave, and also Simon Theobald, and they say bye, see you soon. But we already have a couple of other questions, one by Faiza, and then the second one by Stefan. So please, Faiza, I think you were first.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit more about the reason which caused these various dispositions among these two groups. How much of this, like different engagement with the social material world, how much of this relates to just like, I don't know, like their tradition, their interpretation of Sufism, or how much of this is just like social political, and what causes these differences?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of it has to do with like the amount of sort of, I'm calling it training, or their familiarity with like the classical literatures, which doesn't mean, and it's not a shortcoming of the folks who are, understanding it in terms of, again, of the loss of the sort of socialized self. In a way, it's a bit more freeing, because if if you train and you train, and they're like, this is what fana means, like this is what Bistami seems, this is what Junaid says about fana, then you're going to be more kind of tied to parroting is strong, but it's sometimes harder, when you're overly trained, or have more familiarity with that, to maybe put in your own kind of spin on that. So I think the level of training, people's familiarities with that was a big reason as to why some, would articulate it in more, casual language, and others would use it in these more theological terms. I do think there's some element of it which it fit into their kind of broader understandings of the position of Sufism within their lives. So for the ones who are looking for, so you have young people especially who were kind of looking for an alternative a practice of faith that was not the Islam or even the Shiism, of the state. And so in some ways they do see Sufism as something like antagonistic, maybe antagonistic is strong, at least an alternative to sort of the state. So when you're coming through it, maybe from that perspective, it can be a bit more you know, then you might be still more engaged with the social, you know, you're coming for it. And none of these are like either or questions. A lot of them are also interested in the more philosophical concepts as well. But, you know, if you're coming as like an alternative, be like, you know, they're not even that like this anti-state or something necessarily, but they're like, well, I was looking into these more, you know, the esoteric tradition. But that might also have a little bit of, you know, change some of the framing of you know, how you approach it. And so, you know, and there are folks who I mentioned it very briefly with like Abdullah Khan who are invested in the miraculous. Like there's a number of people who would say, not just this group, but other groups, more actually in some of the other groups who would say like, I could see the Sheikh fly. I saw it with my own eyes. He could cure the sick. You know, they'd have dream visions, things like this. And those tend to be pushing, you know, the boundaries of less invested in sort of rationality, obviously. And so in those cases, they tend to have a broader overview. That sort of broader overview can move more towards a more, I just think like more classical theology sometimes. But some of them also were very much invested in, you know, just the literatures and the writings, and I think that could also, you know, look towards people's understandings. And some were totally again, like were disillusioned and also just like didn't want to talk about the social. They're like, that's not what is interesting or drew me to Sufism. But the funny thing about that is that it still plays kind of like a role in their lives vis-a-vis the social realm. And this is, you know, another way of framing this project is like the impossibility of the apolitical, or in a way where even if you're moving it as a way to move away from politics, that in itself has like, you know, that is in itself a political move. So yeah, that's a very long way of saying I think it's, you know, there are other factors that you can be tied together with these under observations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, Stefan.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's an amazing book, and I've been using it in my teaching already. And
Oh,
it's
thank you.
just it's especially a really great contrast to other kind of ideas of the cultivation of self, especially in relation to listening. And so that's been really really helpful. I have loads of questions. I'll try and just say one. I think one thing that kind of stands out for me is this, the way that, you know, you and your interlocutors kind of talk about the social world and this kind of relationship to the social. And I guess that's because maybe I'm like also particularly interested in the kind of communal and maybe kind of social relations which exist within Sufi communities, no? And how, in a way, that those kind of forms of sociality, those relationships, whether with a sheikh or with other dervishes or other initiates or other members of those communities, how those relationships in themselves, social relationships, can also be a way of kind of dissolving the self, or whether it's through like service or submission to a sheikh. You know? So yeah, I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how it's, in some ways, it's also possibly kind of creating alternative forms of sociality which are different to what goes on in other parts of their lives, but at the same time are very social and relational. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. That's a great question. That's something I wish I addressed a little bit more in the book itself. So there's a few ways I think about that. I think about, you know, how the communality and, you know, the social and the collective. I think there's a few ways how that can tie to, you know, alternatives to the self. And I think that's very much there. I can see that in sort of two examples I can give. One, and the one I was mentioning here, about why listening is often seen as like, it's great to do it on your own, great to do it whenever you can, but there is something powerful about coming together as a collective to do it. And I think both the sheikhs and the sort of lay Sufis, dervish, all are very much in favor of this. And in the case with the Osmayesh, he will write about like what does it mean not just for your own heartbeat to become aware of your own heartbeat, to understand yourself through this way, but also being in like a sea of heartbeats. And in some ways, you're not just an individual person anymore who's unbounded, but it's not a group of people, but it comes like a group of heartbeats. And, even things like seeing someone who's listening, seeing different people's reactions, are they crying, are they laughing, is a way of understanding that this is like a space of alterity, it's a space of a different ways of being. And so everything from like the listening body, but also I think it's a multiplication of being in a space where everyone's kind of at least trying to be outside of like the everyday self, the rational self is seen as a place of support, and as a safe space sort of as well. So that's one kind of example. The other one that I've seen that comes to mind is I worked with these two smaller groups too, and they were led by these two separate sheikhs who didn't know one another, but they had similar understandings of their role as authority figures, where they said because of sort of the limitlessness of the text, they were authority figures because they would lead people in reading groups, essentially. And then they would also, so their authority was based on textual interpretation. But they believed because of the sort of unknowing of the text, the endlessness of the text, which a lot of people in Iran believe, or a lot of just literary scholars would be like, yeah, of course, you can read Hafez till you're blue in the face and it'll still be, there's still endlessness. But what's interesting was that they, used it both to sort of question their own authority. And I think it did lead to sometimes different dynamics that I've seen with other like reading groups in Iran. Because they're so common. And in many cases, there's a lot of people like the clergy will also sometimes say like, oh, what do I know? What or something. But it's a little bit more sarcastic, rather than these who are really invested in it. So you have these collectives where the leaders would be like, I can give the right questions, but I can't give the right answers. And I think those collectives can sometimes have like a little bit of a different energy and sort of sociality rather than where there is the sage. Even if the sage is asking you to question them and things, I do think there's a little bit of a difference there. And so that's another kind of element of how, these social collectives can, be very different from based on having these interpretations of this sort of more unbounded self, both unbounded self, unbounded texts that are. So yeah, but thank you. That's a really great question.
Okay, is there any other question? Or I have one broad question actually, Seema.
Sure.
Actually, the book and also your presentation today focused on the idea of unknowing, okay? And basically, as you said, unknowing doesn't mean anti-knowledge, but it meant another kind of awareness. And this is what my question is about, actually. We have also worked with Dili together on thinking of Muslim forms of cultivation as different forms of knowledge, actually, more than unknowing. And and this is also a move that helps us to go beyond, the secular understanding of what knowing is. And I also noticed that, for example, in your slides, you translated knowing as aql, okay, so something related to intellectual. So I don't know if we can also think, beyond and in more comprehensive terms what knowledge might mean, and as something that can include also all these other forms of experiences, also as a way to criticize what are conventional, understanding of what knowledge is in academia and beyond it. And this reminds me also of another passage of your talk, which was the one about the heartbeat reminding your interlocutors of something of their origin or the origin of things, so reality basically. This is another aspect that actually we are discussing with Lily accidentally these days. And so this idea that there is a form of knowledge that actually is the eternal knowledge. So a form of knowledge which is higher than the conventional idea of knowledge we have. Yeah, okay, this I think is my
No, that's super helpful. And it's something I still think about and turn to, and I'm always looking for. I can say a few things there, but so I struggled. It started off, I wasn't sure it was necessarily about knowledge. I did things with aesthetics. I went down to different forms of knowing. But I think, to take this, some of it, sorry, I'll say this. One question, a difficult thing I had was the translation of matter fact. Often it's used as gnosis in English. I don't know, in French, I think often it's gnosis as well, but then that term itself can be so hollow, I found. And you're like, wait, what is gnosis? Mystical knowledge, or it always to have this sort of caveat of another type of knowledge. And so I'm thinking of like, well, we're operating, and so this is like within the English that I was trying to sort of make, people were like, it's not that type of knowledge, but like mystical knowledge itself is not is also kind of a very broad category. So there's two things. It's one, looking at sort of the classical literatures who do have all these different terms, like matter of fact, like like all these different ideas. And I think it's just trying to see that there are, and I think just at least in English, there aren't the words. There's always there are qualifiers for the noun. Like the closest I got, and I had that Bataille quote at the end, is like experiential knowledge. And now how is that different from learned knowledge? And if we think about experiential knowledge, what does that mean? It's gained from experience. How is that more, and there's something about that which is very different from something that is taught. It's harder to qualify, it's harder to quantify often. And also it came a lot from speaking to my interlocutors who were saying they're like, they study, they're like, oh, you're a talib, you're coming. And first they would say, speak to the sheikh, you want to learn. I was like, yes, I want to learn. But they also would tell me, this can't be taught. You have to live it. I'm speaking about the poetry. You don't just read, Hafiz, you have to live Hafiz. And so, thinking about that, what does it mean? I've come to learn about how people understand Sufism, and they're like, understanding is a big category. And so when I was told like, well, you could know it, you could never know it, this insisting on, like, you'll never know. And there are lots of jokes with Insan Shenasi, like, you can't know anybody, even my family would make bad jokes and be like, do you know me? And, so that's silly. But these other forms of thinking that, and then in turn are often tied to, not always, but can be tied to other ways of being in the world that I see as not entirely commensurate with, the liberal autonomous self as the locus, the rational thought. And this gets to Siv on your point about like the alternative sort of cultivations of the self. Personally, with my interlocutors, there is a point, like, most of them are not pushing out the rational at all. Like they accept, they're all saying like, yes, Shariat, you need that. That's the ethical self, the radical, whatever self, the rational self. But that will only get you so far. And the idea that knowledge is something active to gain, but you don't have a full control of it. And ultimately the idea that, yes, they need to, the rational self is there, but it only takes you so far. And then there's something non-volitional, which takes hold. And it's, the surrender, and thinking of that though as knowledge is, I think, sometimes will push against, again, the sort of liberal autonomous self, which is like, you gain it, you do it. Here, it's like you experience it, it's given to you, but you also strive for it. So it's not, and this is something I I did find and want to emphasize that it's not a passive thing. Like, even in states of Hall, um, you're in and out and you have to work to sort of to get there. So it's a weird thing in that it's like a lot of it's non-volitional, but it is still something that you have to work to yourself to get into the state in a way. And sorry, and then the last part you mentioned, the second part you mentioned sort of the heart reminding us of what is already there. Yeah, very much so. That's sort of a very classic Sufi idea that the a priori is with, the veil. You have to, it's all the world is already there, the unseen world, the world of the divine. Although often my interlocutors, which gets confusing, will talk about the real as the world of God and the unreal as the world we're all living in. Especially one group was into that. And so that makes the world a lot more malleable, the world we live in a lot more malleable. But the idea is like it's there. You just have to know how to look for it. You just have to cultivate this weird instinct kind of knowledge, the sixth sense they talk about. And you see that with language of veiling. It's like just remove it. It's there. So on the one hand, it's like a journey. It's all these very as I said, that quote in the beginning, it's graduated, there's stages. But then at the same time, it's there, it's possible. And, I love the literature about how it's like deep in the heart and the layers of the heart. And some of the medieval stuff is like there's 7 layers and you go in and there's one and the other and the other. And so it's a journey to the internal as well. But there's always this affirmation that it's there, it's the a priori has been there. So yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting to think about.
Okay. Is there any other question? Does not. Maybe Lily? Okay, yeah.
Maybe before we conclude, no, I was still thinking about the gradation and the states, and of course, I always was wondering, well, there are grades and spiritual states, but the person, yes, someone would not know of these grades, or is it possible? I'm always wondering because I mean, if you are in a spiritual state, you wouldn't know it, because you are not you anymore, and so on. So that was one question, but also the familiar and unfamiliar, because I was also thinking that there is and the unknown, because in the end, it seems that, of course, my interlocutors were also speaking of becoming acquainted with the unfamiliar and the unknown during the zikr. But then, of course, this unfamiliar is ultimately quite familiar because it is the remembrance of what is already there. So there is a certain ambivalence, and the unknown is, of course, something we know deep in our hearts. So I think that this is also quite interesting how we use these terms. And so just some thoughts, final thoughts about what you were presenting. Yes.
No, that's great. That's super interesting too. I'll start with the familiar, unfamiliar. Yeah, I think on the one hand, sometimes I think of the unfamiliar familiar divide is that when you sort of apply matter fat to the regular world, things can be put into question. So you think you know the self, but this is a way of saying, no, you can become unbounded, and this is all illusory. Um, and in that same way, but at the same time, there is this like move between the forgetting and the remembrance. And so I think there's this move to have these moments of destabilization. And I talk about this elsewhere there's a quote from Abu Nasr, who is a 10th century thinker, who says, true zikr is that you forget your zikr. And that you remember, but you remember to forget. And so there's this like, and so you have these moments where you're like, the ideal is that, and that's why you have all this repetition and the zikr, people are saying Allahu over and over. It's like you're creating this moment of unfamiliarity or like forgetting, so you can have that heightened awareness of remembrance. So I think there's that like circular, but yeah, very destabilized, exactly as you're saying, the moving back and forth. And then the a priori stuff as a whole that's already there, as a whole other, that's really interesting too. It's like a whole other element to it, where it's like you're becoming aware what's there, but you're forgetting at the same time, or ideally forgetting, so you can have this like heightened awareness. But mostly I was thinking the unfamiliar as like, challenging the bounded categories of self and other places, memory, place, etc. And yeah, the stages are fascinating too. Yeah, sometimes people, and it varies. Most of the folks I work with didn't go into like deep trances or anything, but I've certainly heard of people who were like, I don't remember where I wasn't there. In the literatures, not all of them, but like some of them will also have it in a way that they'll talk about it as like Al-Ghazali has it as Wajd is the middle one. It's oh, I'm blanking on the first. I think it's listening. I think it's Sama is the first one, like in engaged listening, which is more the rational thought, and then it's ecstasy, it's Wajd, and then the last one is movement, actually. So that I always find fascinating that it's like beyond, we'll get beyond ecstasy, but it's like then it's the body, then it's some sort of unwilling kind of mode. But yeah, where is that line, and are you aware of those sort of stages during the experience? It's probably harder to say, but I wonder if then someone could say, this is just totally me speculating that, is this, does that mean that, it's observable that you're in these stages? And someone can say like, oh, you are moving all over the place, or you're rocking your body. And then, do you remember or you don't? So sometimes the stages are observable, but sometimes they're not at all. And it's all like they're stages of concentration or travel to the internal, which can be different. But yeah, the level of consciousness and consciousness and awareness of these stages is really fascinating. Once I read something where they were like, this is just offhand, where they were like, only the sheikh can know like what stage you're at, or what like heart level you've accessed. So always really interesting about where you are in the path. And some folks are like, you can regress, and others will say you can just keep going, your plateau, if you will, stay there. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you, Sam.
Yeah. Thank you to you, Seema. I think we can conclude here our seminar. Thank you again, Seema, for being here today.
My pleasure.
Engaging presentation. And thank you everyone for being here, for those who attended or stayed until now. And okay, we'll follow up with news about the network and following events and meetings of the seminar series. And Seema, stay in touch. And okay, hopefully see you soon.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Take care.
wonderful. Thank you so much again for the invitation, for listening, and for coming, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. Hope to read more, and hope we keep in touch soon. So
Yeah,
thank you.
okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.